I want to begin tonight by asking you a question that may unsettle some of you, but is essential if we are to face reality. How long can an empire sustain itself when its foundation, the very currency that underpins global trade, is beginning to crack? For decades, the United States dollar has been the unrivaled king of international finance, the anchor of global trade, the symbol of American dominance. But history teaches us that no empire, no currency, and no economic system lasts forever. We are witnessing today what I call the unraveling of the American empire, marked by a weakening dollar and the unmistakable rise of China. To understand this, we must first remember what gave the United States its power. After World War II, the world lay in ruins, but the U.S. stood tall. It had the industrial base, the military might, and most importantly, the financial credibility to establish the dollar as the world's reserve currency. This was not just an economic arrangement. It was the backbone of American empire. Nations across the globe needed dollars to trade oil, to invest, to settle debts. And as long as the world needed dollars, America could print them, borrow endlessly, and live beyond its means while other nations carried the burden. But the question I want you to consider is this: what happens when the rest of the world decides it no longer needs the dollar? Every decline sparks a new beginning, and to understand this truth, we must look at history with clear eyes. When the Roman Empire collapsed, it was not simply an end, it was the beginning of Europe's transformation, opening space for new cultures, institutions, and ways of life. When the British Empire receded from its position of global dominance, it did not mean humanity regressed. It meant that new nations stepped forward, new voices entered the conversation, and the global order adjusted to reflect realities that the old empire had ignored. The same truth applies today. The decline of the United States dollar and the erosion of American hegemony are not merely endings. They are signals that something new is being born. The question we must ask, the hook that should catch our attention, is not how do we preserve what is fading, but rather what can we create from the ashes of decline. If we focus only on loss, we miss the opportunity embedded within it. Empires have always maintained themselves by controlling resources, imposing their rules, and shaping global systems to their advantage. But the moment they falter, when cracks begin to appear in the foundation, people everywhere rediscover a certain freedom. They see that no empire is permanent, no system unshakable, and suddenly the imagination is liberated. What was once impossible becomes possible again. Consider the ordinary worker who realizes that the U.S. no longer has a monopoly over global trade. That worker might feel fear at first, but if they look deeper, they will see possibility for fairer trade, for new partnerships, for a society less burdened by the demands of sustaining an empire that has long forgotten the needs of its own citizens. There is a profound psychological power in recognizing that decline does not equal defeat. It is easy to hear about a collapsing dollar or the rise of China and feel overwhelmed, to think the future is only darker than the past. But let me turn that around with a challenge. What if decline is the very condition required for progress? When one structure breaks down, it clears space for another to be built. Just as forests depend on fire to renew the soil, societies depend on the fall of outdated systems to create room for innovation and justice. The U.S. dollar's weakening grip on global markets should not be read only as a warning. It should be understood as an invitation, a call to rethink the way we organize our economy, our trade, and our relationships with one another, the real tragedy would not be the end of the U.S. empire. It would be our refusal to seize the opportunities that come after empires end because they exhaust themselves, because they exploit too much, because they overreach. But when they end, people begin again. Workers can demand a system that values their labor rather than treats them as disposable. Communities can insist that wealth serve the many rather than accumulate in the hands of the few. Nations can forge alliances based not on domination but on cooperation. The collapse of an empire, frightening as it may appear, is one of history's most reliable teachers that renewal is possible, even inevitable. Think of the stories we tell ourselves about resilience. Every family that has faced hardship knows this truth. When one chapter closes, another begins. The loss of a job may hurt, but it can also lead to a career more fulfilling. The collapse of a relationship may bring pain, but it can also open the door to deeper connections. In the same way, the decline of a global empire may seem catastrophic, but it is often the seedbed for progress. So ask yourself, are you willing to see beyond the fall and prepare for the rise that follows? That is where real strength lies, not in clinging desperately to what was, but in stepping boldly into what can be. In the coming years, as the dollar's supremacy weakens and China's influence grows, we will hear endless talk of loss, crisis, and fear. But if we choose, we can tell a different story. We can remind ourselves that every decline in history has been followed by renewal. We can remind ourselves that endings are also beginnings. And we can remind ourselves that this moment, unsettling as it is, carries within it the seeds of transformation. The collapse of one empire may indeed be the rise of something fairer, more balanced, and more humane, but only if we have the courage to see it that way. Crisis creates courage, and this is one of the oldest lessons humanity has carried with it across generations. When people are pushed to their limits, when the ground beneath their feet begins to shake, they discover strengths that had been hidden, lying dormant until necessity forced them to rise. This is not just a poetic notion, it is a hard historical truth. Look at the Great Depression in the United States. Millions of families lost jobs, homes, and hope. Yet out of that suffering came a generation of workers who organized, who demanded rights, who fought for the protections we later took for granted: Social Security, unemployment insurance, the right to unionize. The crisis did not merely destroy, it ignited the courage of ordinary people to demand change. The hook we must grasp here is simple. If crisis strips away comfort, it also strips away excuses. When we consider the decline of the US dollar and the erosion of empire, many will see only danger, and indeed danger is real. But within danger lies an equal measure of opportunity. It is precisely when old systems collapse that human beings show their most remarkable capacity for resilience. Courage is not born when times are easy. Courage emerges when survival is on the line, when old certainties vanish, and when people are forced to create new paths where none existed before. Think about it. Would we ever know the true measure of our potential if we were never tested? Crisis, uncomfortable though it may be, is the teacher that demands we step out of complacency and into transformation. The psychology of fear often blinds us to this reality. People cling to what they know, even when it no longer serves them. Empires know this and exploit it, creating illusions of stability while the foundation is already rotting. But when the illusion shatters, when the dollar is no longer the unchallenged global currency, when living standards are squeezed, when global shifts become undeniable, that is when courage is born. Courage is the act of facing reality, refusing denial, and daring to imagine a better way forward. In such moments, people realize that waiting for the empire to save them is futile. They must save themselves. And that realization is a powerful catalyst for action. Consider how societies have responded in times of upheaval. In moments of deep crisis, ordinary individuals become extraordinary. A single worker, once fearful of speaking up, finds the courage to lead a strike. A community, once resigned to poverty, discovers the power of collective action. A nation, once dominated by foreign interests, asserts its independence. These transformations do not happen in times of calm, they are born in the storm. So the challenge I pose is this: what courage will you discover when the systems you rely on begin to falter? If you see only collapse, you miss the gift hidden within the crisis. If you see the possibility for renewal, you embrace the courage that history has always rewarded. Crisis also redefines what we value. When an empire falls, when a currency weakens, people begin to ask fundamental questions. What really matters? What kind of society do we want? Do we measure strength in military bases and financial markets, or do we measure it in the well-being of our people? These questions, provoked by crisis, demand courage to answer honestly, and once answered, they demand courage to act. That is why decline can be such a fertile ground for transformation. It forces us to let go of illusions and face the truth with bravery. Courage born of crisis is not individual alone, it is collective. One person may find strength, but when communities discover courage together, that is when revolutions are born, when movements take shape, when the impossible suddenly becomes possible. The fall of one empire may feel like disaster, but history shows us again and again that it is also the birthplace of profound change. The courage that emerges in such times is the bridge between despair and hope, between collapse and renewal, and that courage, once unleashed, is stronger than any empire's decline. Adaptation is power, and nowhere is this clearer than in the great turning points of history. When circumstances shift, when old ways of living and working collapse, those who survive and even thrive are not necessarily the wealthiest or the strongest, but the ones who adapt the fastest. Nature has taught us this lesson for millions of years. Species that could not adapt to change, whether sudden climate shifts or new environments, vanished. Those that learned to adjust survived and multiplied. The same principle applies to human societies, economies, and even empires. The rise and fall of nations is not determined by who has the largest armies or the biggest banks, but by who can adapt to a new reality with intelligence and courage. That is the hook we must pay attention to. Survival belongs not to the most powerful, but to the most adaptable. The United States dollar was once the unchallenged center of global trade, but the world is changing. Nations are moving toward other currencies, building alliances outside Washington's reach, and experimenting with alternatives like digital currencies and regional agreements. Many Americans may see this as a threat, and it is, but it is also a test. The real question is, will America adapt to a multipolar world, or will it cling to the past and decline faster? The same question applies to every individual. When the systems you rely on start to shift, do you freeze in fear and hold tighter to what is slipping away, or do you learn, adjust, and discover new possibilities? Those who adapt will endure. Those who refuse will be swept aside. Adaptation begins with awareness. To adapt, you must first accept reality, not live in denial. Empires often collapse not because change was impossible, but because arrogance blinded them to the need for it. Britain could not imagine a world without its empire. Rome could not conceive of life beyond its dominance. And today, many in the United States cannot picture a global order where the dollar is not supreme. But denial never protected an empire, it accelerated its fall. On the personal level, denial is equally dangerous. A worker who refuses to learn new skills as industries change, a business owner who clings to outdated methods, or a society that ignores the warning signs of decline, they all meet the same fate. The ones who survive are those who look reality in the face and ask, how must I change to meet this new moment? Adaptation also requires humility. It takes courage to admit that the strategies of yesterday will not work tomorrow. For decades, the United States relied on military and financial dominance to secure its position. That strategy is weakening now, and what is required is cooperation, innovation, and shared prosperity. Likewise, in our personal lives, we often cling to habits that once served us but no longer do. Adapting means letting go of pride, recognizing that circumstances have shifted, and being willing to evolve. Think of it this way: is it strength to cling to what no longer works, or is true strength the ability to change before the collapse becomes permanent? The power of adaptation is also deeply creative. It is not only about survival, but about discovery. When individuals, communities, and nations adapt, they uncover new ways of organizing, of producing, of relating to one another. In crisis, someone invents a tool, someone else discovers a new method, and entire societies transform. The rise of China itself is an example of adaptation. Decades ago, it was considered a poor, developing nation. Through shifts in strategy, investment, and a willingness to change direction, it has become a global economic powerhouse. The lesson is not to glorify China, but to recognize the principle: those who adapt reshape the future. Adaptation is power because it gives us agency in moments that feel uncontrollable. A falling empire, a declining currency, or a shifting global order may seem overwhelming, but within those changes lies the opportunity to act differently, to adjust, and to create new systems. The empires of the past that adapted survived longer, and the individuals today who adapt will be the ones who write tomorrow's story. The challenge before us is to stop asking how we can preserve what is fading and start asking how we can evolve to meet what is rising. In that shift of mindset lies not just survival, but the power to thrive in an uncertain world. People build the future, not empires, and this is a truth that history often hides behind the shadow of kings, generals, and presidents. The headlines of our past are filled with the names of rulers and empires, but beneath those names are millions of ordinary people whose labor, creativity, and courage made everything possible. Without workers in fields and factories, without teachers shaping young minds, without communities sustaining one another, no empire could stand for even a day. Yet the illusion persists that power rests in institutions, currencies, and armies. The real power has always rested in people. The hook we must recognize is this: if people built the past, then people will surely build the future. Empires rise and fall on the backs of those who keep them alive. Yet, when the structures crumble, it is not the end for the people. It is the beginning of something new. When the Roman Empire collapsed, Europe did not vanish. People adapted, communities reorganized, and new societies emerged. When the British Empire retreated, its colonies did not cease to exist. They rebuilt themselves, shaped their own destinies, and redefine their futures. The same will be true if the American empire, built on the supremacy of the dollar, declines. The empire may weaken, but people will continue to work, dream, and create. The question is not whether an empire falls, but whether the people seize the moment to shape something more just and humane. The danger comes when people forget their own power. Empires thrive on convincing citizens that they are powerless. That change can only come from above, that the collapse of an empire means the collapse of life itself. But look closer, and you will see the truth. The farmer still plants seeds, the parent still teaches their child, the worker still builds the world around them. These are the real forces that sustain societies. The fall of an empire may shake institutions, but it cannot erase the fundamental truth that ordinary people are the architects of tomorrow. So I ask you, will you wait for an empire to tell you how to live, or will you step into the role of building what comes next? People build the future through collective vision. One voice can spark an idea, but it is the chorus of many voices that makes it real. When workers united during the industrial age, they transformed unsafe, exploitative conditions into movements that gave us the weekend, fairer wages, and safer workplaces. When communities came together during civil rights struggles, they dismantled oppressive laws and demanded justice. None of this came from empires granting favors. It came from people insisting on change. The same is possible now. The decline of American dominance and the weakening of the dollar should not paralyze us with fear. It should remind us that no government decree or imperial collapse can silence the will of people determined to create a better life. There is also a moral dimension to this truth. Empires are built on domination, but people can choose cooperation. Empires thrive on inequality, but people can demand fairness. Empires seek to control, but people can cultivate freedom. At every turning point in history, it has been the choice of ordinary men and women to rise above the systems that oppress them and insist on something greater. That choice lies before us today. If the dollar no longer guarantees American dominance, if the empire begins to falter, then the stage is set for people across the globe to shape a new order, one rooted not in domination, but in collaboration. The most powerful reminder of all is that every empire that has fallen has been replaced not by nothingness, but by new societies built by people who refuse to give up. The collapse of institutions does not erase human ingenuity, resilience, or determination. In fact, it often unleashes it. The fall of an empire is not the end of history. It is the handover of history back to the people who make it. And those people are us. The power to build the future is not in Washington or Beijing, not in currencies or armies, but in the choices of communities, workers, and families who dare to believe that they matter. So ask yourself, if people build the future, what role will you play in building the next chapter?